This episode of the Cosmic Skeptic podcast is brought to you by you. To support the podcast, please visit patreon.com/Cosmic Skeptic.
So welcome back, everybody, to the Cosmic Skeptic podcast. Take number 2, because we just tried to record this and realized that I wasn't actually recording, which is always great. So this is an opportunity to move away from the snappier style of YouTube videos that I tend to make and have long-form conversations with interesting guests. Joining me today is Matt Dillahunty, who most of you will know from The Atheist Experience. He's a host there, which is the live call-in show run out of Austin, Texas every Sunday. But also a public speaker and debater. You've probably seen some of the videos and talks that he's given. And if you haven't, then I recommend that you go and check them out. He's shared stages with people like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson, among others. So thanks for being here, Matt.
Thank you very much. I've been looking forward to this. I don't remember exactly when somebody first introduced me to your content, but I was like, yes, pay attention to this guy. And then on Sunday the 28th, day after tomorrow, you're going to come down and do the Atheist Experience live, which people will actually probably be able to see before this is...
Absolutely, yeah. By the time this episode goes out, people will be able to watch that. So if you go and find the episode that airs, the episode of the Atheist Experience that airs on the 28th of April 2019, you'll be able to see the episode that we've done together. But yeah, I remember it was maybe a year or two ago now that you first, I think you just reached out on Twitter, you sent me a message or something, and then you said, actually, when you first reached out to me, you said something like, people have been saying to check out your content, they've been saying I should get you on the Atheist Experience, we obviously can't do that, but let's collaborate sometime, and then fast forward, and here we are, and we're doing exactly that. So
took ages, but here we are.
It's great how time flies, and I'm excited to be here, but we're currently in Dallas, Texas, for the Faithless Forum event, which also all the footage from that will presumably be online. It's a big sort of YouTuber-run conference. I'm going to be there. Matt's going to be there. We're here with a whole host of other people. So you'll be able to watch that too. But then we're going to drive down to Austin and do the Atheist Experience there. But while we're here and while we've got some time before the conference, I thought it'd be fun to record a podcast episode with Matt. And whereas previously with other guests, I've tended to talk about specific topics and had a specific reason for bringing them on, with Matt, a lot of people have suggested you as a guest to have on the podcast. It's kind of a no-brainer. Cool. But they all want me to talk about different things with you. But one thing that they all kind of have in common is some kind of relevance to ethics and morality.
Right.
So I think it would be good to begin if you could give us an overview of where you stand as in your views to ethics and morality, because previously you've said that you kind of take a Sam Harris line, but I'm not sure if you agree with him on everything or if there are important differences there. What would be your kind of meta-ethical framework?
Well, I don't agree with anybody on everything, including me.
Right.
That's how you end up changing your mind. For a while, I gave a talk on the superiority of secular morality. And my goal there was to have a sort of packaged response to accusations that atheists, secularists, et cetera, didn't have any sort of foundation for morality. And I stopped giving that talk. Normally I don't repeat talks, but this was one I gave in several places because I felt it was important. I stopped giving that talk after Sam published The Moral Landscape because we were largely on the same page with, I'm not exactly sure. I mean, Sam and I have talked about this. I'm not exactly sure to what extent we do disagree. I know there are some small things. There was one thing in the book that I talked with him about where I thought his example was potentially flawed, but going back through the book, I couldn't find it again when he and I were sharing a stage because I wanted to rehash it. My take is pretty much based on a foundation of well-being. I didn't use the well-being label, so that was what I was talking about, but I didn't have the neat package that Sam put it in, where he's drawing analogies to health, like physical health, which I think is great because, health isn't particularly well-defined and we don't know everything about it. And it seems to parallel how we understand morality fairly well. I don't, by the way, I get asked this question a lot. I don't know when I might have answered it. I don't think I draw any useful distinction between morality and ethics. I mean, to me,
Yeah.
they're two labels for essentially the same thing. When people parse it out into like subtle differences, I understand what they're talking about, but I don't make the distinction myself that much.
Yeah, I think we can just treat them as synonyms. But so the view essentially is one that I think most people share, and I share in a roundabout way too, that morality and ethics are essentially just concerned with well-being.
Yeah.
And I suppose what I want to ask you is a deceptively difficult question, which is why? Why should we care when we're talking about what is right and wrong and good and bad? Why is it that well-being, as opposed to any other possible quality, like virtuousness or hair color or whatever, like what is it about well-being in and I don't know if you see it in an objective sense, but how can you justify the view that should be the focus of what we're talking about when it comes to right and wrong?
Yeah, on morality, I've talked about objective morality, and by that I think morality is objective only in the sense that I can make objective moral valuations once I have a goal. The goal itself may ultimately be subjective. So depending on how my detractors want to frame it, they'll say, oh, well, you're talking about subjective morality. Well, I am if you talk about the core value of we're going to focus on well-being. I've used a chess game as an analogy before, because the rules of chess are ultimately arbitrary. We made them up. The goal of chess is, some would say to win. I would say it's to not lose, considering the number of draws we end up having. But once you have that as a goal, you can then evaluate moves within the game to find out which ones move you closer to that goal or further away.
Right.
This issue that you're specifically asking about is one where I'm not even convinced Sam did a particularly good job, and there may not be a really good answer, because ultimately it comes down to, well, why should we care about well-being?
Exactly.
That's the nutshell. Okay, you've said morality is about well-being. Why do we care about well-being? I kind of have addressed that in two ways. Number one, if somebody doesn't think that that's what morality is, okay, fine. I won't use the morality label with that person. I'm happy to throw out any label that's getting in the way of conversation between individuals. I think that what we've always talked about when we talked about morality, I think well-being is the best example of what we're talking about. But if somebody says, oh, that's not morality, then my answer is, okay, then I don't care about morality in the sense that you do. I do care about well-being. As to why we care about it, some of the examples that you started to give and that anybody could give, when I ask somebody, what do you mean by morality? Well, right and wrong behavior, or the sort of things that make life better or worse. And they're always really kind of ill-defined. And anytime I've been able to get someone to focus on what they mean, what is their standard or goal, it seems to me to be encompassed by well-being in some regard or another, which is why I'm fine with that being the label. Now, to be fair, probably one of the things Sam's most criticized for is that well-being isn't particularly well-defined either. And it is kind of a weasel word of, well, what are you talking about when you talk about, oh, I'm talking about well-being. Well, what does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, so for me, I avoid using the term well-being, not out of principle. It's just not my favorite term to use. But to me, what well-being essentially means is pleasure and the avoidance of pain.
I include that as a facet for sure. I think that there may be, I worry that sometimes those get perhaps overly simplified, or that it might be a little too reductive.
Okay.
But I'm not sure, because that's another thing is when you talk about pleasure and pain, obviously you're not merely talking about physical pain, but you're also talking about emotional pain and other things like that. Mm-hmm. That may in fact be all encompassing. But the reason I went with the well-being label is because I didn't have a good label. And when Sam presented that along with, analogies to health and things like that, it made sense to me. And I was like, that's good enough for a start, because none of us are claiming that we've solved morality.
Right.
It's an ongoing process.
Okay. So when you talk about well-being, are you talking about your well-being? Are you talking about the well-being of a society, of a tribe, of a species, of what is the well-being applying to? Because for me, the meta-ethical view that I have, which we can get into if you want, I might be interested to hear your thoughts on it. but it essentially breaks down to a view that it's like a psychological utilitarianism that says that the only thing that can be ultimately desired in and of itself by a human being is their own pleasure. And from that, I can reason that, evolutionarily speaking, as a social species, it makes sense that we should care about other people's pleasure because it's intertwined with our own. Like you can read Dawkins in The Selfish Gene, you can read Singer in The Expanding Circle to explain why that would be the case. Would you follow a similar line of reasoning, or do you jump kind of straight to well-being in general is a good thing?
No, my reasoning is almost identical.
Okay.
I've actually argued that, because what comes under attack quite frequently in these discussions is how do you justify altruism? And I've made the case that I can justify what people call altruism from a purely selfish point of view.
Yeah. So how would you do that?
I want, if I'm only concerned about my life and the pleasure and pain of my life, or the benefiting it, it's undeniable that I have to share space with other people on this planet. My actions affect them, their actions affect me. And so it's often in my best interest to do things for other people. Now, personally, I get a great deal of pleasure personally from doing things for other people. Watching other people, something I've done's made somebody happy or benefited them, I benefit from that. And I realize that that's a psychological, trapping from our evolutionary history and our starting with, small tribes and expanding. But even if I were completely selfish, I would still need to take the actions that also benefit society because I benefit from society. That's where I think people get short-sighted.
Right.
It is not, I'm doing good for somebody else because it raises my stature. Sure, it might. When I work with Atheists Helping the Homeless or one of those organizations, it makes me look good because I can come on a video like this and say, well, I work with Atheists Helping the Homeless. And that it clearly benefits people's perception of me. But it's also the fact that I'm contributing to making the world a better place, and I will benefit from that as well.
Yeah, that itself is a selfishness, the pleasure that you receive from knowing that you've done a good thing because you have empathy or something like that.
People get a view of selfishness where it's me at the expense of others.
Yeah, but it doesn't have to be. It's like ethical egoism.
It's why I'm an educator to some extent. We can argue about to what extent that's true, but I have no kids. So why would I care about supporting public education and higher education? It's because the more people around me who have a better understanding of the world, the better the world is for me as well.
Right. So do you think there is such thing as a genuinely selfish, selfless act? Do you think there can, like metaphysically speaking, is it possible to do an action that is genuinely selfless with no personal benefit whatsoever?
I'm not only not convinced that that's possible, I'm fairly convinced it's not possible.
Yeah, I don't think so either. And I have an interesting thought experiment to perhaps demonstrate this. I want to ask you a question, which was put to me in a pub one night from a physics and philosophy student at Oxford.
As most good questions are.
Precisely, yeah. And I haven't stopped thinking about it since. And the question is this: would you rather kill an innocent person and then immediately forget that you'd done so, or not kill that innocent person, but live the rest of your life thinking that you had and living with that guilt?
That is an incredibly good question.
I'll tell you why I think it's such a good question, because one of the first things that people will want to say is, well, of course, I would rather not kill the innocent person. But I think it requires a bit more thought than that. I'm not necessarily asking what should you do. I'm asking what would you do? What would you be capable of doing?
It's an incredibly difficult question because it's ultimately impossible, or essentially impossible, because when I'm reflecting on the question, evaluating them, it's hard to imagine a scenario where I don't remember.
Yeah, and in fact, that's the problem with a lot of like criticisms against utilitarian views of ethics. Like people say, for instance, when people talk about ethics being your own well-being, it's like, ask a parent, would you rather their kids do really, really well, but the parent believes the kids are doing terribly, or the kids do terribly and the parents believe they're doing really well? Well, the utilitarian should have to say that the parent would rather their kids do badly because they're chasing after their own pleasure. But the reason why parents wouldn't say that, the utilitarian can come back and just say, well, that's just because they can't imagine that. Like they have the benefit of this kind of omniscience of the situation.
Right.
And I think the same thing happens here. But I think it's not unreasonable to suggest that the rational thing to do in that situation, in the situation I'm putting to you at least, is to have yourself kill the innocent person and then immediately forget. I feel like that would be not necessarily what you should do, but what enough people, if you give it enough thought, realize that they actually would.
That's roughly where my instinct kind of came down on it. That for my own benefit, not remembering that I'd done something awful, would probably be preferable. On the other hand, from the omniscient standpoint, the world would be better off probably in most circumstances where I didn't kill someone but had the memory of doing it.
Yeah, so this illustrates why I think we can say quite confidently that there's no such thing as a truly selfless act, because if you were able to choose, so if you were to choose to kill the person, then that shows that really you are kind of selfish in an ultimate sense. Whereas if you choose not to kill the person, the only reason you could possibly do that is because of the pleasure that you derive right now from this position of omniscience, from knowing you've done the virtuous thing, right? So whichever way you spin it, you're getting something from it.
Yeah, it can only be viewed from that stance. That's why it's almost impossible to remove yourself from that situation, because if I killed someone and immediately forgot it, obviously it would have zero impact on my life that I'm aware of. But this is the curious thing about the ability, the theory of mind of putting yourself in somebody else's position and developing empathy. If in fact I had not killed someone and had the memory and suffered personally for that, I would have to probably say that the world would be better off, and I would benefit from the world being better off, even though I wasn't directly aware of it, because I would be, suffering.
Yeah, but again, you need that position of omniscience to make that.
You can't get there
to make that judgment.
It's one of the reasons why I love so many thought experiments and the intuition pump type thing that Dan Dennett comes up with.
Yeah,
I love these, and there was a similar question to that I'd been asked at once, but not that one specifically. And even just sitting here talking about it, I'm not sure that I could give an answer, because it's so difficult to divorce yourself from the question stance.
Yeah, so let's ask a slightly different question, which is, rather than what you think you would do, what do you think you should do?
I would argue that, given what I understand about the broader, there are a couple factors that we can't possibly take into account. Like, yes, it's an innocent person we're talking about, but that doesn't mean that their innocence makes them a benefit to society in a way that would impact me.
Sure, okay.
As opposed to, a hindrance. But by and large, I would go with the one where I would say that the right action, I think, is to do the one where I would be suffering for something I didn't do, because ultimately, if we're assuming an innocent person and all other factors being equal, I would still benefit from that, even in ways that I wouldn't see.
Right. Okay. So the view of ethics that you're taking, I'm interested because you're saying that it is essentially taking this self-interested, egoistic view of morality and being able to apply it through methods like empathy to apply to other people. What do you do when faced with somebody who, let's say they don't have an empathy for people who don't share their skin color?
Right.
And so you can even using sort of your objectivist moral framework, the best you can possibly do is say that your pleasure is a good thing. And they say, well, listen, my pleasure is not predicated on the pleasure of people who don't share my skin color. So I'm not going to care. I'm not even going to take those people into my moral framework or consideration. What do you say to someone like that?
Well, I think you have to have a conversation where at least there's some motivation, assuming that I'm convinced they are wrong. And there needs to be a way to have the conversation where they can potentially realize that they're wrong.
And do you think that they're wrong in the sense that they should be empathetic, or do you think they're wrong in the sense that they are actually empathetic, but they just don't kind of they haven't tapped into it?
I think that showing that their selective empathy is a bit myopic.
Okay,
is the path to go down, because I haven't met that many people who truly would go down that path. And I know some people who are fairly awful racists. I've met people like that. But getting them to recognize that they're drawing a line that is in the incorrect place because, you know, someone with skin color that doesn't match yours doesn't tell you anything at all about what they're going to contribute to your life, what they're going to contribute to the world. And that seems to me to be almost undeniable, that yes, you might prefer this. When you asked the question initially about the selfish motivations, et cetera, and I talked about altruism from a selfish perspective. The other aspect of that is that I think people, because I care most about me and then people around me and people I care about in these expanding circles, I think most people overlook the impact that others are going to have on the world around them, and how much that's going to affect them. We see the immediate, and it's been described as, you know, looking at the world through a slit, you know, where you perhaps with bad eyes, where you can only really intuitively understand the immediate gratification, the short-term effects, and obviously it gets incredibly frustrating when you talk about, well, why should I care about a butterfly in Sri Lanka just because it might have an impact?
Right.
There's nothing about it that's easy, but if somebody said to me, you know, I only care about people who share my skin color, then I would ask them how they justify that, knowing that people who don't share their skin color have done things that have contributed to the betterment of the world, and people who share their skin color have done things that have affected the world in ways that are detrimental.
Okay, so do you think that a person's moral worth, given that morality is predicated on your own well-being, and when I say your own, I mean you in the general sense,
Sure.
like whoever is doing the thinking, does that mean that the moral worth of an agent, a person, a thing, is predicated on its effect on your well-being, or is there something more than that? The reason I ask is because let's say that this person then changes their tune and says, well, okay, so people who don't make a net contribution to society, and that doesn't mean people who are evil, that just means people who perhaps just live their life doing effectively nothing.
Sure.
I'm not going to take them into my moral consideration at all, because they're not contributing to society in such a way, or even if they do contribute to society, they might not do so in such a way that benefits me. So to me, I don't feel like it's strong enough. I feel like it's too weak a principle, because you can come around and you can say, well, there are loads and loads and loads of people on the planet who genuinely will have no effect on my well-being in the positive or negative sense. And yet I can't just omit them from my moral consideration. Like when there's a famine in their area, I can't just say, well, I don't care. Surely there has to be something a bit more than just how it's going to affect my own well-being.
Yeah, I tie this to a couple other things that we mentioned actually before we started shooting, and that's the world is complex, and I'm not confident that I'm able to accurately assess for any individual. Like we talked briefly about, there are people who may never change their mind, but I don't know who those people are until after I've spoken with them, and maybe not even then. And so I can say, okay, my experience with this person is such that they're now entrenched in this mindset, be it bigotry or whatever, and maybe they'll never change their mind. But I know that the capacity for people like them to change their mind exists, because we've seen it.
Yeah.
And not knowing whether they fall into the category of people who aren't going to change their mind or people who are, mean that the best course of action that I can come up with is to treat everybody as if they truly have the potential to change their mind and engage with them along that front. I think it's similar. I can't tell who's going to impact my life in what way until after it's happened.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I've had people who were genuinely good friends of mine who I trusted implicitly, who turned out to be just the most awful sociopathic liars who took advantage of me and other people. And yeah, that hurts. I tend to be incredibly positive in the sense that, okay, I learned a lesson there too. You know, now maybe I'm a better judge of character. But because I don't have that omniscient level of knowledge, I have to, the most expedient way for me to make those assessments is to say, you know, maybe Alex is just terrible, or maybe there's a conflict between us, but I'm going to continue to operate under the assumption that people are generally decent or subject to, you know, reason.
Mm-hmm.
and that there's going to be some impact on my life, hopefully positive, that I may not be able to tell right away. And worst case, how I treat you affects your life in ways that where even if you don't directly contribute or even dramatically indirectly contribute to my well-being, people who care about you might. And so let's say, you have a sibling who is going to discover a cure for cancer, but if I, kill you or destroy your life or whatever, that fundamentally changes their path. The variables are too complex. And so for me, erring on the side of hope, for lack of a better word, seems to me to be the best course of action.
Sure. Before moving on, I'm just interested, based on what you said a minute ago about people and changing minds and susceptibility. When was the last time you changed your mind?
Oh my!
I don't want to spring that question. I don't want any hesitation to be taken as an indication that you haven't. It's hard to, I know it's hard to pin down, but.
Well, it's easy to say I've changed my mind today on small things, right, just from the course of us having a conversation about changing a better way to talk about something, or perhaps, I remember Stephen and I had a conversation on Rationality Rule on his channel about free will, and I've always identified it, or largely always identified as a compatibilist, a la Dennett. But during that discussion, I clearly, obviously changed my mind on how I was going to talk about those things. And it reminds me, we had like a 3.5 hour discussion on nonprofits one time about free will. And it turned out when it was all over, we all agreed on what we do and don't have. We just disagreed on what to call it.
Yeah, exactly. I find that happens all the time.
And there were plenty of things that I've changed my mind on. Bigger things are rarer. I mean, obviously, I changed my mind on the God thing, going from a fundamentalist Southern Baptist to an atheist. Yeah. That I changed my mind on a number of political issues over the years. Like there was a period of time where I was like a full-on Rush Limbaugh, ditto head, ultra conservative. And I think there was somebody who changed my mind the other day, not in a dramatic sense, but in a slighter sense, on the issue of cultural appropriation and where you draw the lines on that.
Okay. Which way did they move you?
I'm going to get in a lot of trouble for this. There are serious concerns about what gets labeled as cultural appropriation. My take on it's fairly simple. If you're doing it to caricature, disparage, or malign some ethnicity or culture, that I would find objectionable. But if you are not, intent matters. And merely, my wife has a dress that's a Mexican dress. And there was a period of time where she wasn't sure if she should wear it because people were criticizing, oh, you're appropriating Mexican culture. The truth is that she bought it from a Mexican woman at the Dia de los Muertos festival, at some point. And it's done not to disparage anybody, and not even as a celebration. It's, I like this dress. And I've seen people go far too far in the sense of, if you're creating fusions of cuisine, you're culturally appropriating. And I think that's absolute garbage. We have to consider that I would argue that nobody owns culture, and that I'm not particularly tied to this notion of even preserving heritage, which annoys some friends of mine. There are people in my family tree who formed one of the first churches in the Southern Baptist Convention. I don't care. It contributed to the world, but it doesn't define me. And so I to whatever extent I enjoy studying history, it's a curiosity, it's informative, but to say, oh, this is my culture and therefore nobody else can do anything with it, it's almost like you're trying to copyright sounds.
Yeah, I mean, like, culture itself is just an amalgamation of previous cultural influences that come together to create.
And I don't mean sounds like songs, because I know somebody's going to be, well, you can,
Yeah, but I know what you mean.
Sure.
It's interesting. But that's why I feel like cultural appropriation is not a useful term in the slightest, because when you're talking about the mockery of a culture for the purpose, the intent of actually making a mockery, then it's not cultural appropriation, it's cultural mockery.
Yeah.
And so if the only kind of form of cultural appropriation that matters in a negative moral sense is the type in which you're making a mockery, surely we should just sort of do away with the idea of cultural appropriation as a whole.
Well, I think it's a term that it may be falling off. One of the things is that there's a lot of things that are ill-defined and people jump on board with and like, yes, that's bad. And then they try to lump as much other stuff in as they can. I'm opposed to people doing blackface because I know the impact that it has on African Americans. This was an old minstrel show mockery. That's not what I would call cultural appropriation at all. I know organizations that ban the wearing of Native American headdresses and stuff like that. I think that probably has more to do with the fact that the Washington Redskins have a name that offends Native Americans, and so all of that gets lumped in together. I don't think that anybody doing it as a celebration or an appreciation of a culture has done anything that I would consider wrong.
Right, and you kind of and what you kind of didn't really think this before. This is something that you.
Well, there's the notion that the people who are part of this group get to define what is right or wrong with respect to their group.
Okay.
And rather than now viewing it as they get to define what's right or wrong, it's I'm willing and eager to consider that they are offended or bothered by something and then take that on board to decide how I'm going to act. And so I did a video once that was about don't use that word, where people were trying to engage in some language policing and offense. And I pointed out that there's a context in which there's not a single word we could come up with or have ever come up with where I think that it's necessarily offensive or problematic on its own. There are some words, like we will say the N-word, because that's what
strange,
people do.
Isn't it, how that happens?
I recognize I've met people and they talk about the real damage and harm and emotional trauma that is tied to words like that. And as an individual, I have to decide, okay, I'm not going to use those words. Actually, I never had to decide not to use it because it was pretty much drilled into me to begin with. But now at least I have a better justification for why I don't use the term.
Yeah, but you can't even use it in a meta sense, in the sense that you'd use other words.
We actually had a conversation on a podcast recently where I uttered the word specific. It's one of those things where if nobody knew what the N-word was and you just said the N-word, what word do you mean? What word is it? So there's certainly, even everybody would recognize that context.
That is not the same. Some people just don't. Some people, I found that it does not matter the context in which you use that phrase. It's like you just cannot go there.
Yeah, I have personally, I've never had any interest in using it, certainly not in any derogatory sense. And that's just about being respectful about what somebody finds offensive. But there are occasions where someone will tell me, oh, I find that offensive. And my reply is tough shit. I mean, I can appreciate the fact that you do. I think I'm not talking about this specific, any specific words. People would say, oh, well, if you say the F word, I'm going to be offended. And I don't care.
Yeah.
Because I see no rational justification to be offended by that. I do see a rational justification for being offended and by words that are racially bigoted and things like that. I don't run around telling people, you can't say this or you can't do this. That to me becomes it's like jokes. There's no sacred ground for jokes as far as I'm concerned. And what I mentioned the other day in a video is that if you're going to tell a joke, you need to make sure that you're aware of what the target of your joke is and what the potential consequences of telling that joke is. And as long as you're okay with those consequences, which includes being ostracized and considered to be a terrible person by many people, then that's your prerogative. On the other hand, if you're also going to complain about a joke, you should also be aware of what the target of the joke is.
Definitely, yeah.
Because there were jokes that came out after Notre Dame caught fire, and people were like, oh, I can't believe you joke about that. Well, tough. Do you even understand the target of the joke?
Yeah. Bill Maher ran into that problem when he made a joke involving the N-word. I don't know if you saw when it happened. It was
remember
about
the
a year
incident, but I
ago,
don't
maybe.
remember the specifics.
And he got absolutely hounded by it. And what I found was amazing was that the next week or the week after, or something like that. You know, Ice Cube, the rapper.
Right.
He came on the show. He came on Real Time, and he just lambasted Bill Maher for using this N word. And obviously Bill was using it as a joke. And Ice Cube says, "Look, you just can't do that. That word is like a dagger in our back." And then I thought, Ice Cube, how many times have you used the F word, and I mean the derogatory word towards gay people,
Sure.
in your music? And not as a joke, but in a strictly derogatory manner. I'm not hearing any apologies for that.
Yeah, and I think it's fair that he should be called out for that as well.
But what enraged me wasn't so much that he used the word in his rap songs. I mean, it was a different time back then. People didn't understand the weight of the word. Like, okay, fine, you can make whatever argument you want. What annoyed me...
But it's not like he was British. Well, because fag means something different.
We have a fag outside, yeah.
Yeah, and that's something different. But also, I mean, just notice, even in this, there's a fundamental difference about what you and I, even having a meta-level discussion about this, are and are not comfortable saying at different times. Mm-hmm. I know where ICE was coming from. I know why people were really irritated and chastising Bill Maher. I think to some extent they have a strong point. There are very few words I can think of that have been as damaging, but your example is good as well. I'm a huge Eminem fan, and you know, White America is probably one of my favorites from him. I think he's a great poet, but he'll use the derogatory terms for homosexuals in his music as well. Right. And I think that, you know, that should be called out. However, they should also still be free to say it.
Yeah, but so what annoyed me wasn't like Ice Cube's point. Like, I think he had a point. Like, okay, it was the double standard. It was why don't you apply that to yourself? Like, you didn't just use this word as a joke or on a meta level, and people, so it's like that's what you're criticizing Bill for doing.
It gets back to what we were talking about before, where I was talking about how we see through a slit. I care more about me and the people around me.
Right, exactly.
And so there needs to be awareness about these issues. Probably one of the bigger issues that I have is we're constantly working to raise people's awareness. And, you know, it gets labeled woke or whatever, so that you have a better understanding of what somebody else's life is like, so that you can see things through their eyes a little more readily.
Okay.
But we do it rather sloppily. And if somebody doesn't get it immediately, there's often well, you're just a terrible person, rather than, oh, I understand you don't quite understand this yet because my lived experience isn't your lived experience type thing.
Well, I think there's an area which seems to be fairly easy to make the logical step to when you're talking about that specific thing, which is like seeing the world through our lens and struggling to see it from the views of perhaps of others in areas which we wouldn't want to consider people moral monsters for not doing so, but perhaps it's not something that's been given enough thought in the popular conscience. And I think it's time to go there. The one thing that people have wanted me to speak to you about more than anything is animals.
Yeah.
Animals. And I think you're known actually for like not. I don't. Is it like you haven't wanted to engage previously, or is it just like it's always come up in a context where you haven't wanted to talk about it, like on the Atheist Experience or something? Because people will call in to the Atheist Experience and ask about veganism, even though it's practically got nothing to do with what the show's goal is. And yeah, it can be relevant in some ways. And if someone calls in to the Atheist Experience on Sunday, like I'd be happy to discuss it, and I can see how it could be made relevant. But equally, like if they're just asking about it in an isolated sense, it's not for the show. But is that?
Yeah, well, I think there's a perception that's not actually accurate, because I've only spoken about the issue a handful of times. There are occasionally callers, and by and large, it's not an issue for the show, so we aren't particularly interested in taking that call. But because people were interested in my thoughts on it, there were people who asked questions, and we had conversations. And what frustrated me was I despise bad arguments. I despise them most when they're coming from people who share my positions on something. And I spend probably as much or more time arguing with other atheists as I do with theists. However, there's a contingent of the ethical vegan community that much like a contingent in the atheist community, just have really bad arguments. And it got frustrating to the point where once they jumped on board with Matt's doing the show, Matt's talking about morality, I view veganism as a moral issue, and Matt doesn't agree, and so we've got to go after him. And it got to the point where I couldn't even put up a video about Pascal's wager without a handful of the first comments being, answer so-and-so's questions on veganism when you're going to put your video up on veganism and everything else. And in the one conversation where, I'm not going to say his name, but there's no reason not to. Vegan Gains called in and wound up agreeing with me at the outset, because my position on this is fairly simple. It's not a big cornerstone of anything. I'm not necessarily, so I draw a distinction between moral virtue and moral duty, and I know not everybody does.
Yeah, I think they certainly should.
Well, then me and you and Stephen should sit down and have a talk, because he doesn't think that's a line that should be drawn. So we'll do that this weekend.
We'll have to do that, yeah.
Because for me, and I've used a bunch of examples. I don't know which one's best. I'll just go with the charity one. If I don't donate a certain portion of my income to charity, that does not make my moral valuation negative. Like, you are now an immoral person because you didn't donate to cancer research.
Do you think that has something to do with the fact that like your obligation, or not your obligation, the moral virtue of giving to charity, let's say, doesn't have, like, the act itself that you give doesn't have an immediate benefactor that you owe something to. Whereas when it comes to moral obligations, you might say that usually the obligation stems from the fact that you owe something to a specific individual. So if you have a moral obligation to save a drowning child when you're just going to get your shoes wet, then the reason why that's an obligation perhaps is because of the fact that there is an actual agent that you owe that has this right, essentially.
I think this may be a sloppy way to put it, but there's a certain, for me, morality, when it comes to moral obligations, your responsibilities, where if you either do this or you are immoral, or if you fail to do it or you do the opposite, you are immoral. Yeah. That is all about a moral contract between agents. And I'm undeniably speciesist about this, I think with potentially good reasons, but I'm not even sold on that. But in how we were talking about how other people are going to affect our lives and everything else, there's certainly this notion that as human beings, we grant rights, we protect rights, and I'm now in a moral contract with other thinking agents who can express their views on morality.
What about the severely mentally disabled?
They are essentially, grandfathered in isn't the right thing, but they are included because they are part of this group. And so,
as in, you mean part of the species?
And I'm not, by the way, before we go too far down this road, I'm not saying that the species level is necessarily the right place to draw a line. I'm just using it as an example. Yeah. So, if I had one of my uncle's children was essentially born brain dead and lived for years. There was no cognitive ability, nothing. I'm under a moral contract. You could say I'm not under a moral contract with him, but I'm under a moral contract with his parents and with the rest of his family. And I'm willing to extend that, by the way, also to other primates, even to people's pets.
Well, I was going to ask, like, do you think that the moral, whether you see it as an obligation or a virtue, not to torture a dog, a pet dog, is that due to the social contract that you have with the dog's owner, or has that got something to do with the intrinsic moral worth of the dog?
Well, if those are the only two options, it would have to be the moral contract with the owner.
It doesn't have to be those two options.
I'm not necessarily sure that there's any intrinsic moral worth. Certainly not intrinsic, but it may also be a moral contract with myself.
Okay, so I'm interested to know what your criterion for moral consideration is, because can you see the problem that I'm seeing here? And again, this is only scratching the surface of your views. Plenty of room for clarification. But so a moment ago, you said that the reason why you would take somebody who is severely mentally disabled and still consider them to have moral virtue or moral worth is because they belong to a group, which we might identify as the species, but we don't have to. And the majority members of that group have moral worth, and so it's kind of a rule of if you belong to X group and X group is one in which the average has moral worth, then you have moral worth.
So I don't know that I necessarily view it as moral worth. One thing that I didn't quite finish on the moral duty versus moral virtue. I'm not immoral if I don't donate to a charity, but donating to a charity may be morally virtuous. In fact, I would argue that depending on the charity, it almost certainly is.
So what do you make of, I know you've expressed disagreements with Peter Singer, but he has, you may have heard of his puddle analogy. I'm interested on your thoughts on that, which is essentially the view that if you, if you're walking down the road and you see a child drowning in a puddle,
right,
and you think, I can save that child very easily, but if I do so, I'm going to ruin my shoes. Do you have a moral obligation to save that child?
Yes.
Despite the fact that those shoes are going to cost you $50. Now, the question that Peter Singer raises is, if you take that $50 and donate it to charity, you can save a child's life on the other side of the world. And yet, why do we not consider that to be a moral obligation too? What is the difference there?
Yeah, and this is almost in the trolley problem, areas of action versus inaction.
I don't, because in both situations, the action is to essentially donate $50 to save a child's life. And whether that be $50 that you donated in terms of like giving your shoes to nature to save the child, or giving $50 to a charity, commit the action and a child's life is saved. Do not commit the action and a child dies. Why is it that just because the child is on the other side of the world,
that's
or
not the issue.
Through an indirect process, like what is the difference?
The issue is in
there?
geography. It's the immediate danger, and the fact that if there's a child drowning, I am the only one in the area. I am the one, the only one who can fulfill this particular obligation, as opposed to $50 that saves a child life or 50 children's life through vaccination.
But the reason it matters that you're the only person in the area with the child dying is because of the fact, like that doesn't matter of its own accord. The reason it matters is because if you personally, you yourself do not act, then that child will die.
Right.
But the same is true of charity in the sense that, everybody donating to charity is saving lots of people's lives, but your extra $50 will save X many extra children. If you don't donate the charity, or if you do, there are still going to be millions of children dying. But it's the same situation in that if you personally do not give $50 to charity right now, an extra child will die that would not have died otherwise.
Yeah, I think part of it is that, first of all, I'm not necessarily convinced that is a realistic scenario in the same sense that somebody drowning is. But to whatever extent it is a realistic scenario, I think that, and it may be flawed thinking, but it's obviously it's difficult to describe that. If there's someone drowning and there are 50 people standing around watching and nobody's doing anything, whether they're worried about their shoes or maybe they can't swim or anything else, it's kind of like a triage situation where if a whole bunch of people come into a hospital emergency room after a bus crash, you have to figure out in what order to treat those patients. And you may come across somebody who is so far gone that you say, we're going to let you die so that I can save these other 3 or 4 lives. I don't think the math with lives ever really works out, but I think by and large, you can say, okay, here's the best use of my resources right now in this way. And if ruining a $50 pair of shoes saves somebody's life right now, and this is where also another difference on the moral virtue and moral duty. If there's a kid standing out in the road and it essentially has no risk to my life or well-being to save that kid, and I fail to do so, I think that you have been immoral. If there is risk to my life and well-being, then I would consider rescuing that kid to be morally virtuous and not necessarily moral duty.
How silly would it sound to you if I said, well, there's a situation here where there's a kid in front of the road, but it's not a moral obligation Because if I go and push that child out of the road, it's going to affect me. But the way it's going to affect me is in a completely trivial manner. Something like, I can't be bothered to get out of my seat. How would you fit? Would you say that is not enough? Sorry, that is like, yeah, okay, so that has an effect on you, but that is not enough to escape your moral obligation.
Right.
Can you see how people see in precisely the same way, the idea that rather than just being a moral virtue not to kill and eat animals because it benefits you in terms of taste, to just say, well, that's trivial sensual pleasure, and that is not enough to escape.
Oh, I absolutely see how people can do that. By the way,
but that's not something you do. That's not a view that you take.
Well, I'm sure it is in some sense. Saying I can understand how people see it that way doesn't necessarily mean that I agree, but also the framing of it is taste being the only factor, I think, is a gross oversimplification. By and large, it's only in the modern world, in cities and things like that, that one truly has access to the privileged status to be vegan. For most of our history and in most places, that just wasn't an option. You know, there were health issues and other things. I am, for the record, opposed to the way we go about getting food on many occasions, meat. I'm opposed to animal torture and animal cruelty. However, when I point that out, there are ethical vegans who say, well, you know, killing it's cruel, no matter whether it suffers or not. And I'm not necessarily sure that the thing is, I don't think we can boil anything down so neatly, because even if you ate a purely vegan diet, if you walk behind a combine harvesting food, we're doing a lot of destruction to animals, you know, not just insects, but, you know, voles and varmints and things like that live out there, physically killing them and disrupting a habitat. So I think it's kind of a little bit of cherry picking in some sense to say, oh, I'm doing this and it's better. It gets into I would never. So I don't have a problem with veganism, which was one of the reasons why this keeps coming up. As a matter of fact, I'm mostly pescatarian at this point.
In fact, I think you said at one point that you do consider it to be a moral virtue. You think it is a good thing.
I am convinced that it's likely a moral virtue. Okay. I don't. It's you know, the variables are so complex that I haven't spent that much time actually digging in on it. But I know people who do it for health reasons. I know people who do it for ethical reasons, and I don't have any objection. My lone objection was to ethical vegans who say, if you eat meat, you are an immoral person. Yeah. And then failing to back that up with an understanding of morality that fits in with what I accept.
And for the record, I don't think you're an immoral person for eating meat. I just think that what you're doing is immoral.
Now I can see, because you're talking about it in a moral virtue sense. Or
there's a lot to unpack.
What you're doing is doing the same thing I do in other scenarios, which is, if I say you're a liar, I have a friend of mine who, if you tell him he's a liar, that's the worst thing you could ever say, because to him, being called a liar is a complete assessment of his character and worth as a person. When I say you're a liar, I just mean you're human. Every human's gonna lie. And I don't tend to assess the entirety of someone's character. As a matter of fact, I don't even know how to do that. Like the old adage that, you know, well, Hitler probably loved his mother. And you can find something positive about somebody. Is there a balanced scale of moral and immoral actions where you can say, oh, this is a bad person? And I just don't do that. I talk about the actions themselves and not the person.
Yeah, but okay, so there's a lot to unpack about everything you've said. Now, I'm under the impression you said many times that, like, your aim, your goal almost, I see it almost as like a motto of what you do, is to know as many true things as possible.
And as few false things.
Right. Now, equally, you think that morality lives within the realm of objectivity and truth. And so it seems to follow...
Sure. That, well, moral valuations.
Yeah, so it seems to follow that if it's true that killing and eating animals for food is immoral, then you want to know it.
Yes.
Right? So let's unpack this. Firstly, I agree with everything you've said. Like, for instance, the ability to go vegan on a practical level is not available to everybody. And secondly, you don't need to be opposed necessarily. I mean, it's a gray area for me, but you don't need to be opposed to all ways in which animals are killed, just the horrendous forms in which they're killed.
Sure.
But given that, you live in a city, you live in an area where it's perfectly possible to go vegan, and equally, 99% of all of the animals that end up on the plates of Americans comes from factory farming.
Yep.
So even with the caveat of saying I'm not necessarily against all forms of animal slaughter, and even with the caveat of saying there are certain people who can't go vegan, well, those don't apply to you. So why bring them up when talking about, like, for instance, why you're not a vegan? Why bring up those considerations when those don't apply to you?
Well, it's a direct response to a specific simplistic challenge that I've been presenting with on the show. But it's not a response to the whole issue at all.
Yeah. So the reason that I think it's important to think about this is because if it is true, for instance, that it's impossible to go vegan in certain areas of the world or even areas of the country, then perhaps it would make sense to suggest that if people who could go vegan went vegan, that would send shockwaves throughout the country such that eventually the areas which currently now cannot go vegan will be able to in the future. And the only way that's going to happen is if people like ourselves, who are in a position where we can do so, take it upon ourselves to make that change.
Sure. But I think that argument could be used for any number of things without... That is an argument for change that eliminates some of the objections to objections. But when it comes to the morality of it, with regard to my view, which is about whether or not whether there's something necessarily immoral about eating meat, I don't know how I could be convinced of that. And so it becomes a lot about how to go about it. But when I talk about the number of factors, I think what I've seen from some ethical vegans just have, garbage argument, and so do some atheists, and so do I on some stuff, I'm sure. But even amongst the best, they seem to devalue the impact to one's life with regard to financial costs, time costs, pleasure. Now, at no point would I ever suggest that the mere pleasurable experience somebody might have with doing something becomes the overriding factor of whether or not it's moral. But I also would never say that it's irrelevant.
Yeah, it's like one piece of the puzzle, right? It's one piece that all comes together.
And when I look at the whole puzzle and I consider all these factors, it's not about... I'm not drawing the line at humans. I'm gradually increasing the line based on the moral contracts we already have, which is why I'm not going to go with pets or primates and things like that. But I very rarely, apart from maybe a Jane, do I run across somebody who's overly concerned about grasshoppers' well-being.
Yeah, and I think that has a lot to do with the fact that, like you say, our view of ethics is essentially based on well-being, and we've kind of defined well-being in terms of pleasure and pain and the avoidance of pain. And if insects don't have the capability to feel that pain, then you can see why people wouldn't care. Now, there's a question as to whether they do or not.
I think one of the most interesting issues that somebody proposed to me, which I mentioned earlier, was this notion of milk. Cow's milk, which I drink milk. I've eaten cows too, but the thing is, even if you've got...
And they probably
vegans,
came from the same cow,
It's entirely possible. So you've got vegans, and then you got vegetarians and ovo-lacto and blah, blah, blah. I drink milk. And for a while I was convinced that, this is a non-issue. Clearly not even in the same ballpark as whether or not I would kill and eat a cow. And then someone raised the issue of, okay, you've got a situation where a cow is given birth and its calf is taken away so that it will keep producing milk.
Yeah, after forcible insemination as well.
And have you considered the emotional impact on a cow of having, its offspring removed from it and then, continue to give milk? And the answer at that time was no, I hadn't considered that at all. And my answer now is, I don't know that we can actually assess the psychological trauma of a cow. I don't know necessarily how we would go about it, because what I see people doing is saying, an animal looks up at you with those eyes or tries to run away. So clearly it's expressing its desire to not be eaten. And quite frankly, I don't think that most animals can process that on a cognitive level to where they're expressing, no, don't eat me. They are going more on an instinct of, I don't want to be here.
Okay, so let's apply the test to see if this is really actually relevant to your views, which is this. Let's say it happens. I prove to you beyond a shadow of a doubt that when a calf is separated from its mother forcibly, it undergoes psychological stress. A comparable level of psychological stress to if you did it to a human. Would you stop drinking milk?
Sure.
You would.
Yes.
Just based on that alone. So the only thing that's stopping you isn't like a quibble about whether the ethics actually sort of applies to them. It's like,
no, that's so the whole issue is, where do you draw the line?
But okay, the reason I find this so interesting is because, like, we know that animals suffer in the slaughterhouses.
Yes.
So
I'm on record as being opposed to that.
Okay, so let's bring this back down to earth then. We'll go to dinner tonight.
Okay.
And I'll be eating a vegan option.
Yeah.
And you presumably won't be. Maybe you will. Maybe you will after this conversation. Who knows?
Who knows?
But the meat that you will have the opportunity of consuming this evening will have come from a factory farm. We can say that with
quite probably,
with 99% certainty.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure where we're going to eat, and
we can find out if you'd like. But let's say that that's the case. So the situation is, you're sat here with an animal which has suffered and died, and all you have to do to not support that industry, all you have to do is do exactly what I'm going to do, which is say, I won't have that, I'll have that. That's all you have to do.
Sure. But there are also other. So one of the reasons why I'm quick to address the cow situation is, having lived and grown up on a farm and been around cows and milked cows. Granted, I'm not remotely an animal psychologist. I don't see any of the presentations that we would say, yes, this cow is suffering psychologically in the same way that a human would. I don't see an understanding of moral principles. I don't see a way of expressing it, and I don't know how we dig in on their psychology. I'm not saying we can't. I'm not even saying nobody has. It's entirely possible that somebody has, and I'm just unaware of it.
Right.
But that to me is kind of a separate issue than. Yes, I'm not. I am opposed to factory farms that engage in cruelty, but I've also lived and grown up on farms, and
which, by the way, I do clarify, that just means you're against factory farms.
Yes.
Like, I don't think you say you're against factory farms, which are kind of overly cruel to animals. That just means you're against factory farms.
No. So because I don't know for sure that we're using the term factory farm in the same way. There are practices in factory farms that are cruel, that I would never, that I would never want to support, even though I have by buying products in the past. But there are also farms that might get labeled as a factory, which don't engage in that kind of cruelty.
Okay, so to
like, they're free-range chickens, okay.
To clarify then, there's an author, I can't remember his name, but he wrote a book recently called Eating Animals, Should We Stop? And he said that factory farms are like pornography, very difficult to define, but easy to identify when you see it.
Yeah.
Now, to clarify then, and you said you're against some of the sort of practices of factory farms, can you give me an example of a kind of practice that would occur that would be indicative of it being a factory farm specifically activity, but that you're okay with?
Well, no, because I don't know. That's the problem, is I don't know how we're defining factory farm. I can draw a distinction between, chickens being kept in a cage and not being cared for, and being essentially, having beaks cut off and, torture and everything else, versus, on one of my relatives' farm where there's chickens out in a pen, and they, apart from being in a pen, they live a completely normal life, and then you
right, but that's not a factory farm. We could both agree that's not a factory farm.
Yeah, it's just about. I just want to be clear that when I talk about being opposed to factory farm practices, it's not every practice that occurs on a factory farm, because they still they feed them. It's.
I think I'd rather not be fed. My a person who I've been speaking to on and off. I'm going to have him on the podcast. Actually, his name's Ed Winters. He's a fantastic. In fact, I think if you want to, if you're interested in getting more involved in the debate and the philosophical arguments and hearing discussions, he goes out and talks to people on the street. He's a bit like Anthony Magnabosco in that respect. He does a great job of it. He's like the Anthony Magnabosco of veganism.
Good.
His name's Earthling Ed on YouTube. And he tells the story of how he heard of a story of, on the motorway in the UK, a truck carrying chickens towards the farm crashed, and the chickens just were spread out on the road and died on the motorway. And he was like, lucky them. Because you would rather be dead than be in that factory farm. So when you say like, yeah, they feed them, it's like, well, look, I'd rather starve to death than be a factory farmed animal.
You would.
Absolutely.
But you have an understanding that a chicken doesn't.
But the experience of pain is universal there.
Well, this is where I depart from Singer rather dramatically, in that I think he tends to oversimplify things in terms of pain. Like, we should never cause anything pain, and all pain is okay. I don't want to straw man him and say all pain is equal, but when you're talking about this universal pain, there's pain that we actually engage in for the benefit of others.
Okay. But I actually think it's not unfair to I don't think it's a mischaracterization of Singer to say something like, all pain is the same. I think what he kind of means when he says, he's got quotes like saying, when it comes to pleasure and pain, animals are our equals, things like that.
Yeah, and I don't buy that.
I think
other animals.
I think what he, because this was a criticism that was put to John Stuart Mill around the time just before he wrote Utilitarianism, and he addresses it in the first chapter, talking about what utilitarianism is not. He says people have said that people who only care about pleasure will call utilitarianism a pig philosophy. They'll say, why should I care about the pleasure of a pig as much as I do a human? And his point is, well, because humans are capable of a higher level of pleasure than pigs. So the pleasure is like the level of pleasure has the same consideration, but if a human being is capable of feeling more pleasure, then we value the human more.
Well, I think
but the actual pleasure itself is still worth the same.
I'm not going to get the quote right, and you may know it and may be able to correct me, but there was something Singer said that he got a lot of heat for, which is pointing out that a human baby that could not feel pain, killing it would be. I think maybe, if I'm phrasing it charitably, less immoral than killing a chicken that could feel pain. And my objection to that, the reason I think it's an oversimplification, is because you're not taking into account the emotions of the human family that is tied to that infant.
Yeah, but I've heard him talk about it in a multitude of contexts, and usually I hear him say things like that in response to arguments when people try to identify a trait by which they judge whether someone has moral worth. And he says, well, in that situation, we can clearly think of an instance where a severely disabled child is worth less than a pig with a higher cognitive ability. But it's not to you, it might be to him. The question is, what is the criterion
right
by which we are allowing somebody to have moral worth?
Yeah, and this is where we get back to the thing where I don't tend to view it as moral worth apart. I mean, we talked about the contract, which I think could be roughly equal to moral worth as well. And the answer I have to give for all of that is, I don't know. But if I start drawing a line here, and then I gradually move it as I get more and more information. But as someone who, and I'm not saying this is you or Singer or anybody else, but what I frequently come across is people who are revulsed at the very idea of, let's say, killing a chicken under any circumstances. No matter how you go about it, it's just immoral. Mm-hmm. What they're revulsed by and what they're arguing for is certainly an emotional argument, which doesn't mean it's wrong. Doesn't mean they're not being reasonable or rational. And I'm drawing a distinction between, here's a chicken who lives out in our backyard, and then we kill it, pluck it, skin it, cook it, eat it. That's not identical to a factory farm situation where, it's hatched, it gets beaked, lives stuffed in a little cage. And I'm not saying that exempts it from moral valuation. All I'm saying is that there's two situations there that are not identical. I have become convinced that one of them is almost certainly immoral. I am not yet convinced that the other one is necessarily immoral.
So if I gave you the opportunity, if I said to you,
I apologize for the sniffing.
it's fine. I've been coughing as well. It's been pretty bad here. If I gave you the opportunity to say, here's a way to make it such that every single time you have a meal, you can make sure that it is not a factory farmed animal that is on your plate, would you take it?
Yes.
Okay, that option is available to you right now.
Cool.
Right now.
And you're going to say that it's to not eat meat.
Yeah.
Yeah. The thing is, there's a presumption in the way you phrase the question to begin with that makes for an inequality. Because what I'm actually comparing there is there a way for me to eat meat where I don't have any of the immoral problems of factory farming? And that I think is possible as well, as far as I can tell. As somebody who's done every step in the process from killing all the way up to cooking and eating.
Yeah, so I mean, it's possible, but the fact of the matter is that almost every single meal that you ever have that isn't specifically prepared by yourself or someone you know, in fact, I would say probably all of the meals that you have, like in a restaurant, let's say, come from the factory farm. And if you said a moment ago that you're almost convinced that is just objectively wrong, the factory farming industry. If it's the case that every single time you go to a restaurant, that's where your food's coming from, then it's not difficult to just choose something else on the menu.
Sure.
So why don't you do it?
Who said I don't?
Well, I mean, have you eaten meat in a restaurant in the past week?
I ate crab today at a restaurant.
Yeah. So that means that you don't. That means that.
Well, I don't think that the crab was factory farmed or harmed or in the sort of immoral suffering that we're talking about.
I mean, like, have you eaten pork in the past week at like that was not prepared by yourself or a friend in the kind of ethical manner that you're speaking of?
I was going to say probably not in the last week because I don't actually eat
much,
but I actually have because last night at the Thai restaurant I had pork.
Okay, or we could just rephrase it to say, do you think it's immoral for someone to do so? Or whatever. Like there's a situation where you have contributed to an industry that you've already said you think is almost certainly objectively wrong.
Yeah.
But you've done so in such a way that could have been so easily rectified, just so easily by just choosing something else on the menu.
Yes, but that also ignores the other aspects of how and why I make decisions.
So what other aspects do you think, other than taste, come into? So taking a situation because we can talk about the ethics of backyard farming and things like that,
sure.
But in the situation we're living in, when I'm talking, and I know I shouldn't make these conflations, we should be careful to clarify. But I'm speaking generally about...
No, I got you. I just want to be clear because somebody's going to soundbite something and go,
sure,
oh, look.
Of course, yeah. And I hate as much as the next guy when that happens. But so in these cases of factory farmed meat, when it comes to you just going to a restaurant and being able to choose between having pork or having some kind of vegan alternative, what are the factors at play other than taste?
So, other than taste, because quite often... It's a mixed bag as to whether or not I'm going to enjoy the taste in a restaurant most of the time anyway. I'd rather cook things myself. But when I talk about how there's a complex list of factors, one of the things to consider is what's the impact on humans if I stop eating meat?
Sure, so for instance, eating the agricultural industry...
Farmers, ranchers, truckers... all of them lose business.
It's also...
And that contributes to the greater good of humans.
What do you think contributes more to the greater good of humans? Either making sure those people keep their jobs or combating climate change?
Oh, well, now we've jumped into another realm.
The reason I ask is because the agricultural industry is the single biggest contributor to climate change.
Yes.
Far more than travel and things like that, all put together.
Now, to be fair, before I go down this road, this is something that I haven't spent much time in, but have been told about, and I'm fine with. However, is it the case that we couldn't make improvements such that those industries are no longer major contributing factors to climate change, and yet still have those industries.
And not practically, no, especially because a lot of the emissions come from the animals themselves. So
Well, those animals aren't going to go away when we stop eating them.
Well, no, yes, they are. I mean, once the demand... So there are currently unthinkable numbers of animals that are specifically being bred to be tortured and slaughtered. If the demand goes down, then they simply just won't be born anymore. And so the animals aren't going to go extinct.
So maybe the better solution is to do like a Thanos snap and eliminate half the human beings. Because now that fundamentally changes.
Well,
and I'm not... I realize I'm half smiling and I'm not trying to be glib.
Yeah, that's not frivolous. But the reason why I wouldn't accept an argument like that is because the whole context in which we're talking about this, and the reason I brought it up is because you said a second ago, when you're making the choice about whether to eat meat and stuff, you say, well, how is it that going vegan is going to affect human beings and my welfare? Well, obviously, getting rid of half of the population, or even just solving the overpopulation crisis, let's say, is not like... If you just kill half of the people on the planet, that's not good for human well-being.
See, and I'm not convinced we have an overpopulation crisis.
Okay, but even if we don't, you could say that one way to combat climate change would be to cut the population in half. Well, sure. Another way to combat climate change would be
driving cars.
Would be to stop driving cars. But an even better way than both of those things probably put together is to stop eating meat. And in fact, I think the single biggest thing that you can do as an individual to combat your personal, ecological footprint is to stop eating meat. And if that's the case, then not only do we now have a situation where there is the whole argument of the ethical worth of animals, and that's one thing. You've now got this entirely separate argument about the environmentalism and how that's going to affect you and future generations.
So one of the things, and this is not... So first of all, having been presented with this before, I'm not even disagreeing with you on the impact and the way to change it. But the truth of the matter is, I think my objection here isn't even on moral grounds. It's on a matter of practicality.
Okay.
Because we know the overwhelming majority of people aren't going to take this step. And so an individual taking this step isn't going to contribute in...
Yeah, but you can say the same thing about voting. And also, I
don't think voting should be a requirement.
No, it shouldn't be a requirement. But I
don't think you're immoral if you don't vote.
But would you say it's a moral virtue to go and vote?
Yeah, and I'm close to saying it's immoral if you don't vote. Right. However, then I'd have to recognize there are people who are going to vote the exact opposite way if I do.
Yeah, but
that vote might be even more immoral, or mine might be.
Yeah.
So it's not. This is, and I'm glad we're having the discussion because, first of all, there's a perception that I don't know how this got started, that Matt's got this anti-vegan, anti-whatever view. And that's not the case. I don't get that impression at all. It's about whether or not I'm convinced of what's going to be most effective. And certainly as someone in an incredibly privileged position with regard to, I don't have much money, but I have enough money and I have time, and it's fairly easy for me to look into this. It hasn't been a particular priority of mine, because I've got other things that I was concerned about. But I'm concerned about the oversimplification now, which is why I label it a moral virtue, because I could say I would probably be a more moral person and probably be doing more for the world if I just stopped eating meat. Never remotely denied that. The thing is, the factors that would keep me eating meat under some circumstance, not all, have so far outweighed the factors that would make me stop.
And what are those factors, if you had to whittle them down?
Whittling them down is kind of difficult. Most of them we've talked about at some point in here. It is... So the climate change argument, by the way, is the strongest one of all of them for me personally. When other people presented this about, the impact of this, I'm like, right, that's an issue. And if that's the case and I have accurate information, then yep, on board. But that's a separate issue from the types of moral arguments that I'm often presented with, which is, don't kill the poor animals. And the one thing that happened, this is a diversion which hopefully will be clear and not seen that way. During the 2016 election here in the United States, I'm now a fairly left, fairly liberal, progressive, whatever, despite having been on the other side at one point. And yet I'm constantly trying to be measured and fair, even though I'm going to fail. And when people were talking about Trump and people voting for Trump, there were people on the left who were immediately like, you guys are racist. And I have friends who specifically voted for Trump because they got sick of being called a racist when in their mind they're not. And we had to actually educate people on the difference between implicit and explicit racism. And we had to educate people on the difference between systemic codified racism in the sense that we're implementing policies that disproportionately affect minorities. And it was a case of people using the same word in two different ways. They would say, if you're going to vote for Trump, then you're a racist. They didn't mean that you were cross-burning, and hated people of color. They meant that you didn't care enough about people of color, and people of color were being marginalized and disproportionately affected by policies that you were happy to support. That gets to the difference between your motive or intent for taking an action versus your motive for not taking a particular action.
So you can probably see with that kind of with that kind of overall view and quite an important step back view to take of it.
Exactly how it applies to
like
veganism.
People would just think that you just don't care enough about animals,
and they could be right.
So do you know, and I know like there doesn't need to be an answer to this question, because I know that this is a question that can come up with like the religion thing, and oftentimes it's a bit of a silly question, but just in case you do know of anything, do you know what it would take to make you stop eating animal products? Like can you envision some learning of something or something being the case such that you would stop?
I come closer to being able to give specifics on this. Like when people say, what would it take to convince you that God exists? And my answer is always, I don't know, but if there's a God, it knows. You can't do that here. While I probably can't give specifics because
it's hard
honestly,
to say,
it's also not an issue I've spent that much time focused on the specifics about. It's much easier for me to see a path. And like I was saying, the climate change issues, probably one of the stronger arguments for me. And the reason for that ties into what we were just talking about, which ties into something we talked about before. I genuinely don't care about grasshoppers. I mean, until somebody says, "Ooh, grasshoppers are all dying and they're essential for whatever." 99% of the species that have ever lived have gone extinct.
Right.
I don't care that much about this animal, this animal, this animal. Apart from, I'm not going to intentionally go out and wipe something off the planet. And then you get to a point where there are animals that I clearly care about. Perhaps not as much as humans, but there's also humans I don't care about as much as, my friends or family and things like that.
There are probably humans that you don't care about as much as your dog.
There are humans that I would like to see wiped off the planet, except that I recognize that it would be bad for any individual to be able to make that decision probably. Yeah. So it's all about where I draw lines. And that's why I started off by saying I wouldn't eat another primate. Dolphins. Oh, we figured it out. Matt's biased with regard to intellectual capacity. To some extent, that's absolutely true, because that is where I see my moral contract with you is different from my moral contract with a dog, which is different from my moral contract with a squirrel.
What about between a dog and a pig? Pretty much the same level of intelligence there.
Well, the one thing I used to jokingly say, I used to make a number of jokes that I don't regret in the sense that I learned things from them, but they were never intended to be serious arguments for anything. Like I used to say, as long as a cow and a carrot share DNA, I'll eat them both, which is obviously glib and stupid and not actually the reason for anything. But I also would say that my moral contract is reciprocal. So I don't think a shark is immoral for trying to eat me, and therefore I'm not completely sure how it could be immoral for me to eat a shark.
It's probably not immoral for a lion to rape you.
Yeah.
But it would probably be immoral if you went and raped an animal.
I'm not sure. I'm opposed to it. I'm not necessarily sure that I have particularly good reasons for it.
There's a problem with having a view of ethics which says that I only have an ethical obligation towards you if you have the same ethical obligation towards me.
Why?
For instance, I have ethical obligations towards like children. You can see like the relationship between children and adults.
But children become adults. Cows don't. They don't become people.
Well, that why should that matter in that instance? Because so would you say, for instance, a child becomes an adult? Does that mean they become someone who has moral virtue, or do they have the moral virtue already?
So they have.
Because I think they have the moral virtue already.
And this is the thing where I'm not necessarily convinced, because when I talk about the moral contract being reciprocal, it is, first of all, this is why I acknowledge right off the bat that I'm undeniably speciesist, or at least draw the line to include these species and not these. I think everybody does that because, we're clearly not including all species in our concerns about everything.
Well, you'd be surprised, perhaps to hear what I think about this, which is, to me, it is as simple as, I think we have a moral obligation to minimize unnecessary suffering when it occurs, and if we have the possibility to. I think that's a fair rule of thumb. Now, of course, there are a whole host of assumptions in there. Is it really unnecessary? Is it really suffering, etc., etc.?
And what is the cost to us to prevent that?
But that is also suffering. So that just gets thrown into the equation.
But like if I have a dog, or if I have a cat, my wife used to have a cat that was an outdoor cat. I don't hate them. I don't like outdoor cats. Prefer that, these are, we haven't really equipped them to live outdoors the way they used to, so they should be inside. Plus I don't want them climbing up on my car and scratching the paint. I'm not going to kill a cat for doing that. But if the cat runs around and keeps killing birds and squirrels and things and bringing them up and dropping them on the porch, I don't know that I have a moral duty to prevent my cat from doing that. And yet that would be preventing suffering. So do I have a moral duty to keep my cat indoors where it can't go cause suffering to other animals?
That's interesting. I haven't thought about that. But that's similar to questions of like, is it moral to, if you have a carnivorous pet, is it moral to feed them the flesh of other animals? Like, who knows?
I have a snake. It's an obligate carnivore.
But the thing is, even when you take these special cases, it's like when you're having the debate around abortion and people bring up instances of rape and things like that. These are important questions to have, but the fact of the matter is that most abortions do not fall within that remit. And the fact of the matter is that most meat eating doesn't fall within that remit. We are simply talking about...
I agree. We are in some cases talking about interesting thoughts that are peripheral to the subject.
What we are talking about is a situation in which the single biggest thing that you can do to tackle climate change, the single biggest thing you can do to minimize unnecessary suffering without actually having to suffer in a meaningful sense yourself, is as simple as just choosing something else on the menu. That's the situation we're in. And to me, it's very difficult to see how, if we're making a distinction between moral obligation and virtue that is meaningful in any way, how that could possibly not fall within the category of obligation.
I don't remotely disagree. The thing is...
So you think it does fall within the category of obligation?
Well, let me finish this thought, because I think the answer is yes, but the only reason that I'm not convinced of that is because nobody's presented me the information to convince me that that is the single best thing somebody can do. The other aspect of that is there something that we as a society could do, which is an actual practical benefit to addressing the issue of climate change, that would be more beneficial than individuals choosing to eat something else off the menu? It's not like we're on a time scale deadline here.
Well, yeah. So I mean, the thing that the society could do is elect a government which illegalizes meat eating. Like the answer is any societal action is just a group of individuals doing something.
Yeah. So.
Because I don't think that me going vegan has particularly affected the state of the world.
It's about setting an example and hope in working towards
Precisely.
other changes. All I'm saying is you, not necessarily you, somebody can give me the information and data and make that argument. Because right now, no offense to you, I'm happy to accept that you know far more about this than I do, and that your information is likely to be correct. But quite frankly, this is easily the longest conversation I've ever had about this particular subject, and I can't just, as much as I like you, I couldn't possibly just take you at your word. So this is just an issue of ignorance on my part about if it is in fact the single biggest thing that somebody can do.
Right, but even if it's not the single biggest thing you can do, the fact that it is something that you can do and it's so easy, it's not a difficult thing to do.
Yeah, I'm just not convinced that it would have the effect that you say it does.
But you can, I mean, would you see that it has a positive moral effect? Because then we've got a question which is, here is action X, which...
Well, with respect to moral virtue, yes, I'm just not convinced it's a moral duty yet.
So the reason why I think this is important is because in the case of a moral virtue, you could argue that a moral virtue becomes an obligation depending on how much suffering or how much discomfort it entails for the person doing it. So, for instance, charity is a moral virtue rather than a moral obligation. But let's say that there was a £5 note or a $5 bill that was going to be incinerated if you didn't give it to charity. I think it's fair to say that actually you've got a moral obligation to ensure that that goes to charity instead.
Couldn't you also argue that there's a cow that's going to die of natural causes unless we eat it?
Yes.
And that killing that cow reduces its carbon. So it would seem to me that another option would be to ensure that to whatever extent we are engaged in generating animals for food, that we manage our surplus so that, and I haven't seen the data, and I'm basically, I'm napkin doing math here in a way that I can't and shouldn't.
I think the way to look at this is that farmers aren't, I mean, some of them become so because of the conditions that they're working in, but I mean, factory farmers, they're not just sadists. They don't just enjoy torturing animals. The fact is, like, it's not economically viable to have any other situation. So if you have an individualistic case where somebody is a hunter and they go and kill an animal, which was going to have a pretty horrible death in the world anyway, then you probably minimize that animal's suffering. But that's not a sustainable thing to do on a
Well, I wasn't talking
scale.
about doing it for the sake of minimizing that animal's suffering. I'm saying that if the cows are the pollutant and we have a surplus of cows, then it would seem that killing in the meeting and reducing the surplus would be better than to stop eating them and allow the surplus to continue growing. The other thing is that for a government, for example, to come out and outlaw eating meat, that would be a massive disruption to the economy and livelihoods.
Yeah, just
and
like
humans.
the 13th Amendment was.
I'd have to look into it more, but as
well, at the very least, what
are the ranchers and farmers going to do when they have invested their lives and property into having this massive industry?
Yeah, farming would boom. We need people to be growing the stuff that we're eating, regardless of what it is. You know, we're currently we like. Also, the reason why I bring up...
I think if they made it illegal, I think it would have to be done in stages.
Yeah, perhaps. But I mean, people said the same thing about slavery. And the reason why I bring that up is to say, look, even if it were true, that and you might dispute whether it is, but let's just for the sake of hypothetical, let's say that it is true, that we have a society that currently owns slaves, like pre-Civil War US.
Sure.
And it is the case that if we illegalize slave owning, it's going to cause mass disruption to the economy, and people who have built their careers and dedicated their lives to slave trading are going to be in absolute ruin. Would that be enough for you to say, well, okay, actually, let's just illegalize it in stages, or let's not illegalize it? Or would you say, no, this has to end now, and there's simply no moral excuse?
Yeah, but for completely different reasons, and that is those people, we were in a state of hypocrisy where there were human beings who should have had rights who were being denied rights. That's not the same situation with the animals, where, and I mean, you can argue that perhaps they should have these rights, but we're talking about
Well,
they had rights that were essentially codified that we were diminishing for other human beings.
I think we both do think that animals should have rights. The nature of those rights are different, but like, do you think a dog should have a right not to be tortured and killed? And I mean a moral right, not if not a legal right.
Okay. I don't know that I view things in terms of moral rights. I mean, to me, I'm only, it's like when we talked about abortion earlier. I don't tend to debate the morality of abortion ever.
Right.
I only care about the legal status of abortion. That's it. If somebody's convinced it's immoral, I don't care.
But then look. So the reason why I've asked you about it is because that's what you said in relation to slavery.
Right. I think that they had legal rights that were being ignored.
Okay.
If the case is that we should be granting, I'm not sure we should. So the answer is I don't know what legal rights animals should have. I would certainly say that if we were to grant animals legal rights, they would not have legal rights that were co-equal to humans.
No, but the thing is, and Singer makes this point well in Animal Liberation, actually, is for instance, we don't grant men abortion rights, but we'd still say that men have equal legal rights to women, or should do, even if we don't argue that they should have abortion rights, because that would just be absurd. So you don't need to grant animals the same rights.
Sure, you don't have to give them the right to bear arms.
But we can still talk about...
Except for the bears.
But we can still talk about equal consideration when it comes to giving rights.
Yeah.
And the question is...
I have no idea.
The most fundamental of these rights, when it comes to humans or anybody, the most fundamental right that always gets put at the top of the list is the right to life.
Right to life.
Followed shortly by the right to be free from unfair detainment and torture and every single thing that is occurring in a factory farm. And the question is, if we want to talk meaningfully about animal rights, how can we not begin with these most immediate offenses?
And that might be...
Especially in a world where we can stop contributing to it so easily.
That might be the fundamental issue, because where in the process of drawing the lines and moving the lines, I'm not convinced that all animals should, in fact, have a right to live, a right to life, or what that even would necessarily mean or entail. Because, well, things are going to die no matter how we do this. And I promise I'm not setting up a ridiculous example for the sake of this. I just don't know where I fall on even a basic right to life. Rights are something that, for me, and I'm primarily talking about legal rights, I'm not sure that this applies to moral rights. And I'm not sure that I even think that much with respect to moral rights. Because to me, a right, anything other than a legal right, I'm not even sure I can look at it as right, because they're granted and codified and protected.
Yeah, I think it makes sense to think of legal rights as a codification of what people perceive to be moral rights.
Yeah, and if you're arguing that we should make eating meat illegal, now you're codifying rights for animals.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand why people want to do that. I'm just not necessarily convinced. I'm certainly not in that place right now.
So the situation that I feel in as a conversational partner with you on this topic is similar, and it's the reason I brought it up so long ago at the beginning of the conversation, is because, like, it's a perfectly reasonable position to be in to simply say, I'm just not convinced that this is a grave immorality. But you could see the frustration if you were in a conversation with someone who said, it's a moral virtue to not be racist, but I don't think I have a moral obligation. I'm just not convinced that it is wrong to torture black people. And you could say, but it's wrong for this reason and that reason, that, and you say, well, yeah, I suppose you're right. I think it is a moral virtue, but I haven't looked into it enough, and I'm just not convinced. It's to me, it is. Let me put it this way: if you had to see all of the food, specifically that specific piece of food, if you had to see how it was prepared from the beginning before you ate any meal, would you change your diet?
No, I have seen how. That's the point I was making earlier. I have hunted, killed, skinned, cleaned,
but
cooked,
you
and
haven't
eaten.
You haven't done it on a factory farm.
No, but we've already established that I have objections to that. But
Yeah, but that's what I mean. So if you could see how your food was prepared, and the likelihood is that all the food you're eating comes from, like all of the meat that you're eating in most situations has come from a factory farm. Do you think you would change that diet?
it would depend, because I'm not opposed to everything that's ever happened in something that somebody might label a factory farm. I'm also, no way around it, there are practices in factory farms that I certainly object to. And it's undeniable that I've eaten food that's come from that process. So I'm not just dismissing it. But I would be in favor of fixing all of those things before going the next step.
But do you see it as a next step? By characterizing it as the next step, it implies that there's a kind of sense of progress happening here.
I'm labeling it the next step without realizing, without putting myself in the position that's the next step that we should take.
Okay.
It's the next step that we could take.
Yeah, it's we've been talking now for an hour and 40 minutes, and I don't want to drag this out too long, partly for the listeners and partly because you've already been gracious enough with your time.
No, so first of all, I'm enjoying the hell out of the conversation and learning stuff and thinking stuff, and it's why I do what I do. And it's the sort of thing that, I'll definitely look more. As soon as this airs, there will people be emailing me like, here's the 400-page thing on climate change.
There are going to be people coming to me too, because they're going to say, why didn't you press Matt on this? Why didn't you press Matt on this? A lot of the things that you've said, that there are areas in which I wanted to just dive bomb on a specific issue. But the reason I haven't done that is because we would have spent this amount of time on that tiny issue. And it seems to me that you're more in a position where you're, in order to start taking animal ethics seriously, or at least as seriously as people have said that you should, it would take a more kind of step back overview approach.
It might. I'm not light years away from it. There are other things is that because of medical issues, I have certain dietary restrictions, and there's a lot of work involved in figuring out exactly, if I removed meat from the diet, what I would have to do and have to change. And that's not a non-zero impact on the other factors in my life, both financially and time and stuff like that. And so it has been a less pressing concern than other things. It's not negligible. I like the fact that you pointed out even the factory farmers, they're not out there, they're not sadists toward animals. And it's something that I'll continue to work on and study. But
people are gonna have some serious problems probably with the way that I've conducted it. But one of the reasons I've done it in such the way that I have and gone for the specific angles I have is because I know your moral views. I've seen how you discuss other issues, like on the atheist experience with callers and things. I know
we're largely on the same page, except that I'm not there with respect to animals, and a lot of it's going to come from just ignorance on the subject.
Well, it's like I know the kind of arguments that will convince you. So people will say to me, "Why didn't you talk about the level of suffering of an animal?" It's like, well, that's not going to matter unless we get over the hurdle of whether they actually should have ethical consideration. But
also there's the immediate response of, I'm opposed to suffering and unnecessary suffering. How do you define unnecessary suffering?
Yeah.
And is there a way to kill and eat an animal without it actually suffering? Or even being aware that, you chop a chicken's head off, you get a neurological response and everything else. But I'm not sure that, to what extent that qualifies as suffering. And I don't put all suffering as co-equal.
Yeah, and neither do I, and neither do I think you should. Like, if I were on a desert island with a pig and a human and had to kill one to eat, I'd kill the pig. But if I were on a desert island with an elderly person who was weeks away from death and a youthful person, I'd kill the elderly person. But that doesn't mean in the real world I'd justify a meat industry in which we kill and eat the elderly.
And if you're on an island that is plentiful with food that's going to keep you alive and nutritiously sound without killing anything, you do that.
But there'd have to be if there was a pig there, because what's the pig eating, right? And it's
likely.
It's interesting. It's like the point you made earlier about the animals that we kill in order to produce like crops. Well, yeah, but we're already doing that, and we're already producing enough crops to feed the world, but we're feeding those crops to animals, which
right? But the crops that we're producing to feed those animals are ones that you and I couldn't survive off of alone.
Yeah, but in terms of like the destruction of land, like you can see that we're kind of doing that already to support more plant growth than is necessary to sustain the human race in order to sustain the things that we are eating as a human race.
Yes.
So the argument like, as a vegan, you have to kill animals in order to produce your food. Well, yes, but that's why I frame it as the minimization of unnecessary suffering, because there's going to be necessary
killing as
suffering
many
no matter
animals.
what. Yeah,
I get
it's
it.
just about the minimization. And the way I view it, and it's been a fairly recent thing for me, and the way that I've just come to view it is I am in a situation where I have the opportunity to minimize unnecessary suffering in such a way that is practically no skin off my back. To me, that is almost the definition of a moral obligation. And that's where I've landed, And that's where I hope
And
eventually you might be able to go to.
I'm pretty sure I agree with that assessment. It's figuring out exactly how much skin off my back it is, because it's not something that I've, spent time figuring out. So, not to go into various health issues. Obviously, there are people who there are people with health issues who may never be able to go to a fully vegan diet. Maybe they can. We're still talking about people in cities and other stuff. I'm probably 80% there, I guess, in some regards, and I'm glad we had the conversation, because one of the frustrations is, because I've been glib on occasion, and because people have relentlessly bombarded, I can't post a video on Pascal's Wager without, people come on and, why do you hate animals, and, stop doing this. And you're just, it's like when you reach a conclusion, to tie this back to other things, as soon as I became convinced that I didn't have a good reason to believe that a God existed, there's the temptation to go, why the hell doesn't everybody else see this immediately? It's so obvious. Here's the argument. Here's your fallacy is boom, and then you're done. And it took a while, because at the beginning I was really like, oh my gosh, I found my way out of this. It's so obvious. I can fix everybody right away. And the truth is that there's a whole bunch of baggage surrounding this. And like we talked a little bit about earlier, what may be convincing to one person isn't necessarily going to be convincing to another, even if it should. Mm. And then I had to realize that we're all going to do that. Like, oh my, and I'm not saying you're doing it. You're doing the exact opposite by having this conversation. But there are people who are like, oh my gosh, this is so easy. And if you don't get it right now when I explain it to you, blah, 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 here's your fallacy and here's this, then you're just garbage.
Well, it's like, because I think it's really easy too, but only because I've thought about it enough that all of the components that come together very easily, the components themselves take a while to get to, but once the components are there, I think they fit easily together.
I chastised atheists for, I think the phrase I used was, stop patting yourself on the back for getting the correct answer to what I think is literally the easiest question. Do I have good reason to believe in the God or supernatural?
And this, and like better than most people, like because of the situation we're in, like how my views on religion here, mm-hmm. I would, to give you an idea of the fervency of this argument, I'm like, I feel it's an easier question. I'm like more confident in my views about this, the animal ethics here, than I am about the fact that there's no good reason to believe in God. Like, that's the kind of level. And the crazy thing is, not that long ago, I was eating meat. It's just been, what happens, I think, is you hear good arguments and you hear some arguments that aren't that great, and they start kind of building up and coming together, and you think, that's a good argument. Maybe it's morally virtuous. That's a good argument. Like, I can see how maybe, I might go vegan one day if it was practical. And eventually one day it all just comes together and you just say, that's it. And the interesting thing is, in the truck, we were talking about how in debates, and it's not like this has been a debate, but it's a similar kind of prospect. Like, let's talk about this view from two different angles and see where we end up.
Even if somebody views it as a debate, I don't. That's never bothered me.
The interesting thing is that we were talking in the truck about how the purpose of a debate isn't to convince the opponent; it's to convince the audience, because the opponent isn't going to change their mind. Well, I found that while that's true, when I debate people on religion, there's no way that person's changing their mind, but it's great for the audience. Every single time I've spoken about veganism to a non-vegan, every single time I've become convinced that they might actually change their mind.
Yeah.
And it's so rare that happens on an issue. Like when we went for dinner last night, I was talking to Aaron Ra briefly about it, and you know what he's like with food. And he after we'd kind of sort of gone back and forth, and we were talking about the ethics, and he thought like intelligence was a good metric by which to judge moral worth and stuff, and we just talked through it. And then he goes back to his food and says, "You've ruined my steak." And I thought, wow, I don't know what to think of a statement like that.
It is very likely, and I freely admit this, is very likely an issue of cognitive dissonance where. So the one reason I wouldn't consider this debate is because I have zero expertise in all of the things related to animal rights that you're talking about.
Right.
Whereas if I'm debating religion,
That's
okay,
like, I mean, me too.
different
You know,
ballgame.
like I don't have an expertise in either of those areas, but
it's good in the sense that, you know, like I said, I'm probably 80% there on a number of things, and figuring out what that last hurdle is, figuring out, or maybe there's not a hurdle. Maybe I'm right and just, you know, can't express it in a way where
right.
someday I could convince you, oh, that stuff I said about veganism, oh, those weren't the right way to go. But at the end of the day, I'm still stuck having to acknowledge that on a moral virtue front, I have no objection to the possibility that when it comes to animal rights, you are far more morally virtuous than I am. It's just about whether or not it's an obligation, and the concern over the many different factors that go into it that I'm just unaware of.
Well,
or unable to assess.
Let's see if we can take a small step forward here. Like when you said there, and you've said this a few times, you said, you know, I've got no reason to believe why it's not morally virtuous to be a vegan. Can we rephrase that? Is it morally virtuous to be a vegan?
See, and that's where we get into the complexity, because
just talking about virtue here, and I don't necessarily, and I know there are complex issues, but somebody who,
at the end of the day, I care more about humans than other animals, and I'm willing to extend that out.
Yeah, me too.
And so, not knowing what the impact is on other humans by fundamentally changing all of our diets, that's probably the biggest roadblock.
Just for an individual, somebody who wants to, who stops consuming animal products because they recognize that a lot of suffering is necessary to get those things on their plate, and so they stop.
I think my answer
it.
is still no, and maybe this is why. I got a truck. I needed the truck because I've got a wood shop and I've got magic props and other stuff to run around. Is the person who drives a Prius, and assuming we drive roughly equal amounts, I'm certainly polluting more than they are. Is that act of theirs morally virtuous? And is it sufficiently morally virtuous that I'm somehow deficient by driving this? Well, you can go to the extremes, which kind of, you know, I will go to an extreme for the sake of making a point. What about the person who only rides a bicycle? Now we have to take into consideration, okay, yes, they're polluting less, but are they able to accomplish as much?
Yeah, but so this is where this is when we're talking about like unnecessary suffering. And earlier we said, well, there are some instances where suffering is necessary.
Yeah.
The analogy there with carbon emissions is like there are certain people who need to emit more carbon because of what they do, and that's your situation. But it would be more comparable, I think, someone who's like an ethical vegan, somebody who likes the comfort of driving a truck, likes the feel of driving a truck, enjoys it, but decides to drive a Prius instead because they realize it's going to lower their carbon emission, even though they would prefer to drive a truck, but they do it anyway.
But that's why I went comparable to the person who's going to ride a bicycle and around the town. Are they able? They may be satisfied and okay with it on their own, but are they able to contribute as much to an overall good? Like, for one of the things is 90% of the time. Well, this was the reason I had two cars, because I didn't need a truck all the time. But now that I'm divorced and it's the sole vehicle, it's what I drive all the time. Most of the time, I don't need a truck. I didn't need a truck for this trip up to Cincinnati and back. It's just the only vehicle I had. But in the process of doing that, if we're going to go gather up stuff for atheists helping the homeless, humanists at work, whatever, it's far better for me to have a truck that we can load up much more goods for somebody else. Mm-hmm. I'm not excusing the truck or anything else. I'm saying that the factors that contribute, it's easy to say, oh, I've done my part. I've, and even you were acknowledging you don't think you going vegan has had on your own has had a serious impact. And so I think we need probably more systemic change. And even if that means, I'm not quite sure how close I would be to, well, first of all, I think the likelihood of making it illegal to eat meat pretty much anywhere in the modern world is virtually zero.
I give it 100 years.
And you may not be far off.
I've been debating that with the people at the conference here. Thomas says maybe 300-400. Thomas Westbrook says like 300-400 years minimum. Myself and Christina Rad were like, "Are you kidding? It's gonna be." Christina Rad thought decades, and I was like, "I think 100 years sounds about right."
I'm not even sure we'll get religion to manageable levels within 100 years, but at least I think that's feasible.
Yeah, who knows?
And it may be that way, in a staged reduction. Yeah, I might be on board on that. It's an area I need to look into more.
Well, I'd recommend it, and the reason I would is because unlike issues like meta-ethics, which are interesting and important and apply to practical ethics and things, they don't have a real-world impact. If we're right about this, and by we I mean the ethical vegans, let's say, if we're right about this, then it's probably the most important ethical issue of our time. Because yes, there are worse things happening in the world, but not worse things happening in the world that people don't recognize as being wrong. Like, there's still human slavery in the world, but people here don't try and justify that or think that maybe it's not immoral.
From the standpoint of the carbon emissions of climate change, I've always acknowledged that was probably the better argument, and you may well be right.
And it's the same thing. It's the same thing with climate change. It's like, this is quite possibly the biggest ethical issue of our time, and yourself being in a position of influence, if it is the case that we're correct, then it would just, I think it would become a moral obligation to do that yourself. And I think all it takes is the right reading, the right research, and like you say, you've got the time and willingness to do it. And the fact of the matter is that if you come out of that process unconvinced, then we can sit here and have this conversation again.
Exactly.
And you can tell me exactly why that's the case.
Yep. I looked at this and found that, and that's the way it should go.
If you can go away, do whatever research you need to do, come back, sit with me and convince me that eating meat is moral, then I will pay for your dinners for the rest of your life, because I would love a bacon sandwich. I can't tell you. It would be amazing. Nothing tastes quite as nice as meat.
I've said before, and I have friends who say the pleasure aspect often gets shoved off as if that shouldn't be an issue. And I'm not willing to diminish pleasure quite as much as some other people are. And that's why I'm glad we started with this or touched on this topic earlier of how you can potentially get to altruism through purely selfish means. You may be able to get to veganism through purely selfish means.
Yeah, I think it's possible.
But one thing, arguing about presenting evidence for how it's actually going to impact your life, how it's going to impact all of our lives, how it may be essential for curbing climate change effects, which is going to, kill us all if we don't do something.
Yeah.
Fundamentally different from just saying, well, you eat meat because you like it. Yeah, I do eat meat because I like it. That's the other thing is where the burden of proof rests. Now, the burden of proof is always on the claim.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, and you'll probably know better than I would if there is a label for this and what it would be. If I got a friend who believes in God, they're already convinced of something. And so they establish a burden of proof of, you need to show that I'm wrong before I'll change my mind. And I take a different tack on that because I may not be able to disprove a God. So what I strive to show them they're wrong about is not there is a God, but your reasons for accepting there is a God.
And so like, I'm not trying to necessarily convince you or make you think about the fact that maybe it is wrong to eat meat. What I'm trying to perhaps convince you of is that the justifications that implicitly exist within your psychology for you to eat meat are actually misplaced.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is because you can look at it and say, Is it the case that we should have to prove that eating meat is immoral? Or is it the case that we should have to prove that eating meat is moral? And it may be the case that neither of those is where a de facto burden of proof rests, but looking at individuals' reasons
Yeah, it
for
depends on the
either
person,
doing
right?
yes.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so no, here your fallacy is. Here is your
Yeah.
particular flaw.
And then you just see where you end up, like which side of the fence you're on.
And it may be that probably the biggest flaw is that this has never been which is why it frustrates me that people come after me so often on it. It's never been a big issue for me. And I'm like, I got no problem with, I have a problem with exactly one thing. Someone stating that you are an immoral person if you eat meat. Outside of that issue, which is a big hurdle that could be overcome, I don't remotely think it's impossible for somebody to show that I am in fact an immoral person for eating meat, other than the fact that I don't tend to view summations of people's character like that. I would prefer to go with, yes, eating meat is immoral.
What you're doing is immoral. Yeah, I mean,
which, by the way, you can cut that out, and then it'll be just Matt just said eating meat is immoral, and,
we'll
and you get the
see.
soundbite you wanted.
It's interesting. I think what I'm essentially doing is making people immoral, because if you're doing something immoral but you don't realize it's immoral, then you're probably not an immoral person, because you don't realize that what you're doing is immoral. But if I'm trying to convince you that what you're doing is immoral,
It's the difference between being mistaken and
then
lying.
it makes you immoral, because like I'm trying to argue, well, actually, like here's the realization you should have that you are doing what's immoral, and since you now recognize that, you are an immoral person.
Yes.
Like that's kind of like what a vegan activist out in the street is doing, is just making people immoral. But I think it's important, and I think
It is absolutely the difference between recognizing that someone can be mistaken without being intentionally deceptive.
Yeah, and I think you're right. We shouldn't downplay. You cannot, in an objective, ethical discussion, you can't discount any of the factors. So something like the pleasure of eating, as trivial as it is to me, you can't get it away from the equation. And I think it's important for people to recognize at the end of this discussion, like, I am not blind to the allure of I said this in the video on veganism, actually. It's like, look, I'm definitely not blind to the allure of bacon and chicken and beef. But I just don't think that people should pretend to be blind to the incalculable suffering that was necessary to get those things onto their plates. And I think it works both ways.
I have some quick questions.
Sure.
I have a friend who says that nobody likes pumpkin pie. They just like all the spices you put in the pumpkin pie to make the pumpkin pie tasty. I wonder if it's not so much that people like the taste of meat, but the taste of all the things we put on meat to make it tastier.
Quite possibly, yeah.
Another note for anybody who's watching this, who's been sitting there, rapidly tapping away, ready to send me stuff, you can send it to sansdeity@gmail.com, sans.deity@gmail.com. I can't promise responses because I have like 35,000 unread emails, but I am happy to receive actual data, not just,
Yeah, I was actually
emotional
going to
feelings.
say, because like you spoke about some of the responses that you've had after Vegan Gains called into the show, for instance, and I've seen it. I've seen what people have done. I would make a plea, because to many of those people, like, I understand why. It's kind of like, I'm sure you could understand this too. Like, if there was somebody who had a platform and they didn't think that racism was wrong, then you'd probably want every opportunity that you could, no matter what they're talking about, to say, address this point. Like, this is really important. So I understand your concern, but on a practical level, if you want someone like Matt to get to a position where he does agree with you and it is arguing for your case, that's not the way that you're going to be successful. So
it's like, we've commented about 10 times now today that there are plenty of atheists. I think they're correct in that they don't have a good reason to believe a God, but man, they present just the worst arguments.
Yeah,
and they're never going to. It's like Sam Harris wrote a letter to a Christian nation, and there was that chapter on the Bible says pi equals 3. No, it doesn't. It doesn't even come close to anything like that. And with all the problems in the Bible, you picked that out as something to focus on in a really teeny tiny book. It's kind of a waste of effort.
Right. And it's all about placing the arguments too. Like, if people, like I said, if people call up to the atheist experience on Sunday, like, yeah, sure, we could talk about it, but it's not relevant. Like, here we are having this discussion and it's been useful. And if people want to comment and they want to ask questions, like you say, they can email that address. They can put comments on this video or this podcast. They can email into the show if you're listening on iTunes or Spotify or something.
And if they call into the atheist experience, this is what, an hour and 45, hour and 50 minutes. You're about to run out of
2:03. So I'm just waiting for that camera to turn off.
that timer's going to go off. So I won't talk a whole bunch more. On the show, if people call, we can reference this discussion.
Yeah, for sure. And we can just point them in that direction. But yeah, like, pick the location for your arguments and your battles and have them. And it's important to have them. And I'm totally on your side. This is the most important moral issue of our time. But let's think about how we're actually going to practically achieve these goals. And the way to do it is through conversations. I think this has been a great conversation. I've enjoyed it a lot. And I hope that anybody who's listening, and thank you for staying with us for the longest yet podcast on the Cosmic Skeptic podcast.
There are 2 people left.
Well, I hope those 2 people, well, perhaps only one of them, because I can't do this, but yourself and anybody else who may happen to be straggling along liked it enough that you're willing to hop over to iTunes and give us a 5-star rating. We were, very briefly, the number 2 philosophy podcast in the UK, and that happened only because of your ratings. Now, that didn't last, but it can do, and we can climb up those accolades again if you're willing to go and give a rating. Make sure you go and subscribe. YouTube's probably the best place to kind of go to see what you do, and follow the Atheist Experience and watch the show that we did on the 28th of April.
They can Google my name and just find all the other things that I'm not an expert in.
You do. Matt's doing all sorts of stuff, and you can find him all over the shop. And if you're watching this on YouTube, important links will be in the description. But I think, like I say, the longest episode yet. So thanks for still being with us, and I hope to see you very soon. We've got some great guests coming up for the topic of veganism, who I'm not announcing yet, but they're going to be absolutely fantastic. So stick with us. And thanks for being here. And with that said, I've been Alex O'Connor, as always, in conversation with Matt Dillahunty.
Thanks for having me.